By the Book on BFM 89.9.
Hello, you are listening to By the Book with Lee Chui Lin and Sharmila Ganesan. And today, our special guest from the French Embassy in Malaysia, Cultural Counsellor Roland Husson. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
And you might be wondering why we have somebody from the French Embassy joining us. And it's because, of course, Bastille Day happened over the weekend. And we thought, as good a time as any to try to
talk about French literature, I guess, which is a huge, huge topic that spans centuries. And yet when Lynn and I were talking about it, we realized that I think for many people, our idea of French literature tends to be quite narrow. Do you find this when you have conversations with people about what is exactly French literature, Roland?
Well, not really, but maybe because I talk with people who are interested in French literature.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of different things in French literature. It's true that many people, they better know past French literature, Honoré de Balzac, Voltaire. But I think even contemporary literature is quite known. You have people like Michel Houellebecq, are very, very famous, and with a wide range of diverse type of literature.
That's really interesting because I think when we were talking about it, what came up, like you said, all the classics, we're thinking Victor Hugo, we're thinking, just Dumas, just a lot of stories that also tended to revolve around very specific moments in French history and not necessarily perhaps reflecting
contemporary France nearly as much.
And do you find that there has been, in terms of, like you said, this wide range in French literature, what do you think the identity of it is at the moment? How would you characterize it if you could give it a character?
Well, it's different depending on the perspective. I think for French literature in France, you have all diversity. And French literature seen from the rest of the world, first to remind that French literature is the most translated language after English in the world. And so we have books which are very successful abroad, authors like Marc Lévy or Guillaume Musso. They actually talk about contemporary society, French society, but about the globalized society. And, it's quite easy literature, it's not. But then you have, I mentioned Michel Houellebecq, but you have a lot of different authors, and they're actually talking about our society. And in the case of Houellebecq, is mainly the French society now.
Mm. And do you find that there is a big difference between the kind of French literature that gets translated and so sent out into the world versus the stuff that people read in France that tends to remain in the French language?
Of course, there are differences, but not so much actually. The authors which are popular abroad, most of the time they are also very popular in France. You have some cases of some authors which have a popularity abroad and maybe less in France, but most of the French authors who are successful abroad, first they are successful in France.
Roland, I think we cannot continue this interview, without first asking you, do you have a favorite author? We haven't really talked about your reading habits. What do you like to read? Who do you like to read? Who do you enjoy?
You mean personally?
Personally,
That's a very
yes.
personal question. I think that my favorite authors would be of the 20th century, Albert Camus, Romain Gary, so this kind of literature. But I also like contemporary writers. And, in France, we have a lot of writers writing in French, but coming from other countries or other cultures. And I really like this kind of literature. For example, very recently I read a book of Amin Malouf, who's actually Lebanese, but he's living in France. He's actually a member of the French Academy, which is a big institution for the top writers in France. And I do like this kind of literature, written in French, but opening to other cultures and countries. There's one I like very much, François Cheng, who's of Chinese origin, is also a member of the French Academy. Yes, some of his books I really liked. But this literature, when we are talking about novels, one of my favorite authors is Voltaire, for the way he's writing in French. And actually, when I was a student, I did think, because I heard it, some people were doing it before, because for the French, for the exams, we have to write a lot of essays. So to do some reading of Voltaire before going to the exam, it's very good, because I like his style. So I wouldn't say that I can write like Voltaire, so I like the style, and also obviously the content of Voltaire's literature.
I think people like Voltaire or Balzac, they're really what many people think of when you think of French literature, and they tend to have this philosophical, existential sort of approach to writing in their stories, where there are layers that reflect both on society and the human condition. Is that something that is particularly French, especially for writers from a certain era or a certain period?
I think that the fact of trying to find something universal in the story you're telling, even if it's very local, I think that's something which is very French. And I think that, the classics are rather between the 17th and 19th century, because it was the moment when France was one of the dominant power. It was actually the dominant power in Europe. And so that's why and obviously what they have been writing is mainly about this period of time in the history. But I think you find this in the 20th and even in the contemporary literature, the fact of trying to find something universal in the local stories that you're telling.
One thing I'm very curious about is, when you're talking about having people who are writing in French but coming from different cultural backgrounds, is the language itself changing and adapting? Because we do see this with writers in Bahasa Malaysia, in English, where it's often changed to reflect modern usage of language or slang or just specific cultural moments. And I don't know if this is a fair stereotype, but when we think of the French and the pride in the language, I'm curious as to whether there is that evolution of language happening at the moment.
Well, there is, but it's not with the influence of these writers coming from other countries. Surprisingly, or not, writers like François Cheng or Milan Kundera, for example. Milan Kundera was Czech, and his first novel were in Czech. When he went to France, then he started writing in French, and it's for me, it's always been very impressive, because his French is perfect, and it's very, I would say, classical French. So I think that there is a change in the language, and of course the contemporary writers, they don't write like Honoré de Balzac or Émile Zola in the 19th century. But this change, they don't come from writers coming from other countries. I think when they start writing in French, they're the influence of the classics. So their French, I think, is more in this classic way.
So what is bringing about the change then? Is it just modernization and, slang creeping in?
I think that if you take the most successful writers at the moment, I wouldn't say that there is a big influence of slang. There's always been in the literature, in social literature, characters speaking in slang, so you still find it, but there's not a big change in the way French is written in the recent times.
We're speaking today with Roland Husson, cultural counselor at the French Embassy in Malaysia. We're talking about French literature, trying to really just take a tour of it and where it's at this point in time, because, of course, Bastille Day just passed earlier this week. Up next, we continue this conversation. Keep it here on By the Book, BFM 89.9.
Brainy, fancy material. BFM 89.9.
Hello, this is By the Book with Lynn and Sharmila. Today we're joined by our guest, Roland Husson, Cultural Counselor at the French Embassy in Malaysia. Roland is here to kind of just give us a bit more knowledge and insight, I think, into French literature and French writing. And Roland, when we invited you on the show, you said that there were actually some links between, France and Malaysia when it came to literature. Do you want to take us on that tour?
Yes, because talking about the taste of the French readers, I think what is very specific in France is that the French really like stories from abroad. So we have obviously stories from France. And so foreign literature is successful, and particularly Asian literature. I was having a look at the figures of translation. For example, Japanese is 12% of the books translated in French are from Japan. So there is a kind of passion for Japanese literature. And last year, the prize for the best first novel by a foreign writer was awarded to a Malaysian writer, Sheila Coe.
That's right.
Yes, for a book, The Sum of Our Follies. Mm-hmm. And it's a great success in France. And I think she just came back a few days ago of L'Étonnant Voyageur, which is the biggest literature festival in France. And she's been traveling all around France in the bookshops, signing the books. And it's a great success. And I think it's a very good example of the thing that the French are happy to find in literature is very local stories, because our book is very local about contemporary Malaysia, but with, kind of universal story with colors and pictures, and so I was not surprised by the success. I think it's very good news for the relations between France and Malaysia.
So I was actually very interested to hear about Sheila Coe winning this award, because to me, Sheila's story, which is The Sum of Our Follies, is so Malaysian. It's so local. It's set in a small town, almost a village, and tells of local legends, and it's magic realism. And I wouldn't have thought that that's a story that travels well, especially not to a country like France, where they wouldn't have that relatability to that story. So what do you think appeals about these kinds of stories to French readers?
When you love literature, you want to dream, and I think that's what people are looking for. And for example, if you take Gabriel Garcia Marquez, for example, it's very popular in France. So I would say that the same kind of appetite for this kind of stories, which make you dream and you discover another universe. And so I think that's the kind of thing that the French readers like.
I'm also curious as to whether or not your numbers in terms of readers are good. Because if we look at what's happening around the world, I mean, increasingly people read less, or people read different things more. They read online, they're reading less fiction, they're reading fewer books. Books are selling less. What are things like in France in that regard? Do you have a healthy community of readers? Do you have healthy book sales?
Yes, we have. But because I think that there is a strong policy of the government supporting books. So it's the education at school, literature and philosophy. Is very important in the curriculum at school. So in France, you have 370 million books sold, excluding school books, every year for a population of less than 70 million, which means that French by more than 5 books a year. And if there are some studies and the statistics, more than the majority of French read literature at least once a year. So I think that we still have so it's true that now people have television, the internet, but I think that we still have, with the support of the government for books and literature, reader community. And I think I would say that also because literature is really part of the French identity. It's very, very important in the French identity. The French Republic was born of the French Revolution, inspired by the philosophers of the Enlightenment. And I think this is very important in the way even politicians want to show themselves. It's very good for a French politician to be a writer or to show that he's interested in literature. Our president, Emmanuel Macron, he has a degree in philosophy.
That's right. Yeah.
He even married his literature teacher.
Yes, yes, he did.
So I think that it's very important in the French identity. There's one book I really like because the guy is from the same city I come from. It's Ma part de Gaulois, would be translated like my share of Gaul, Gallic share. That the ancestors of the French. And Majid Cherfi, his parents are from Algeria, like many French people now. And he grew up in Toulouse, in my home city. And he wrote his book about his own story. And he really shows how literature was important in him feeling French. His Gallic share is really from culture and books. So I think that there is this kind of public policies supporting books, but also something very important in the identity of the French people.
And does that, it actually warms my heart to think that there's a country where reading is still just so integral to the whole thing, because sometimes in Malaysia, it doesn't always feel that way. And I'm curious to know whether that experience of reading is still a very solitary act, or is it the kind of thing where people are accustomed to talking about books, to debating their favorites, to, having conversations about books aside from just reading a fair amount?
I think, yes, there are communities and which is the very good thing that we have, and with public support. We have a network of public libraries which is with the highest density in the world, 16,000 public spaces for books. We have a network of bookshops, almost 5,000, because supported we have a very complex policy of fixed book price to protect the independent bookshops. And these bookshops, they are doing a very, very good job because they are not only selling books, but they are also inviting authors, organizing conversations with the readers. So I think that thanks to this network of public libraries and bookshops, there is this very very strong engagement of the audience. And I lived a few years in the UK, and I've seen the difference. Our policy of supporting independent bookshops really make a difference in all the cities in France. You have these independent bookshops very active, while it's not really the case in other countries, including in Europe.
And given that you do seem to have this amount of interest in reading, how would you describe what people are reading? Is there a way to say what the French people are reading at this point in time? What appeals to them?
Well, if you take the most successful books of the recent year, I would say you have kind of easy literature like I was mentioning, Marc Lévy or Guillaume Musso. And then if you take the Prix Goncourt, Prix Goncourt is the biggest prize every year of the book. And by the way, you might know that in 1930, the Prix Goncourt was given to Henri Fauconnier for his book Malaisie,
yes.
The Soul of Malaya,
yeah.
which is a book written by a Frenchman living in Malaysia. Mm-hmm. So if you take the Prix Goncourt in the recent years, I think that it's books about French society, in the intimate feelings of people or of life. You have a book like I'm trying to find the title in English, Chanson douce, I wrote it somewhere, The Perfect Nanny of Leila Slimani, which is about a nanny and life of family, relationship between the character. So this part, I would say. And another one would be history. Novels about history. There was a very good one maybe 5 years ago, Au revoir là-haut. The movie, the title in English, because it was adapted in a movie, was See You Up There. about the French soldiers coming back from the war, the First World War, what we call a gueule cassée, broken faces. So you have this kind of books. Recently, one which was L'Ordre du Jour. Sorry, I don't have the title in English, which was about in Germany in the 30s, how the Nazi party came to power with the support of economic groups. So yes, I would say that the part of history, novels about history, is quite important.
That's interesting, that contrast between the intimate and personal and the sort of
world
historical.
History. Yes.
Yeah.
I did want to just ask one thing when it comes to, so the fact that there is this great public support system for places like libraries, like independent bookshops, the fact that philosophy and reading is so integral in the school system, does that also make France a pretty good place to be a writer? Because, I mean, I'm assuming then that books will sell.
I think relatively, if you compare, I would say yes. But then if you talk with people writing in France, I would say it's very, very difficult. You have a very little number of writers who actually can live from their work of writers. So yes, it's still difficult to make a living from writing, but it's always the same. If you compare with other countries, I think yes, the situation is better.
Okay, and you've made, I think, quite a few recommendations through the course of the show. I think just for the sake of people looking for a quick fix for, okay, I'm going to go to the bookshop, I'm going to start reading some French literature, just give us maybe 3 that you think would be good to start with to get a handle on where we're at.
You mean recent books, recent French books?
Anything you'd like.
Well, I think that the last book of Michel Houellebecq, Serotonin, is quite interesting. But one thing that I would recommend is in the French literature, there is something very interesting. It's the view of children. You have very, there is Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince.
Little Prince, my favorite
Saint-Exupéry.
book. One of my favorites.
But you have a lot of books like this. I was mentioning Romain Gary, who's one of my favorites. La vie devant soi, The Life Before You. So it's stories told by children with their own words. And I think that's something which is very specific of French literature and very, very nice.
Roland, thank you so much for joining us today. We've been speaking with Roland Husson, Cultural Counsellor at the French Embassy in Malaysia, to get a more French take on By the Book, because we are in our own way celebrating Bastille Day. You've been listening to By the Book, BFM 89.9. And now, as always, we come to footnotes. And quite fittingly, we think, because we've spent the first bit of the show, or most of the show, talking about French literature, which by its very nature, by the time it's reached us and our eyes is translated, we wanted to talk about translations, because it's such a tricky thing, isn't it?
It is. And, things being what they are, I actually didn't realize many of the books that I read in English were originally translated.
It's taken me a while to realize Murakami. For instance.
Yes, because he's so Western in so many ways.
And he's so prolific. So
Yes.
at some point, you just start to assume that the books that have reached you here are like, yeah, they were English to begin with. But as a slightly older reader, I think that was when I started noticing the bit at the start, translated by, and how sometimes the classics especially will include a note about the translator, which I always thought was interesting.
I first fully became aware of the impact of translation actually with poetry. I'm a big fan of Rabindranath Tagore.
This song of mine will wind its music around you, my child, like the fond arms of love. The song of mine will touch your forehead like a kiss of blessing. When you are alone, it will sit by your side and whisper in your ear. When you are in the crowd, It will fence you about with aloofness.
And for some reason, until I was in my late teens, it never really struck me that he wrote in Bengali, because he translated a lot of his own works, especially his poetry. He translated them. So in my mind, I think the disconnect was, well, he was writing them anyway. But the thing is, what strikes me about poetry, especially when it comes to translated poetry, is this sense of loss. Like, I always feel if this bit that I'm reading in this second language to the writer is so beautiful and fulfilling and so filled with this imagery, what is it that I'm losing out on? And that what is it I'm losing out on always bothers me.
I think a lot of it is probably going to be context, isn't it? I mean, going back to the French example, the first time that I tried to make it through Les Miserables, I found it really difficult I found it very, because I was younger. So every time they mentioned the gendarme, I was like, what is that? And then I would have to go.
Right.
So I was translating for myself every other thing. Even though these were already translated versions, they were still using sort of French words here and there, right? And I think that aside from just the beauty of the language, what you might end up not fully getting is going to be those moments of context. Phrases, kind of little phrases that are very local, that are very specific to the country, which we have here in Malaysia as well, that just don't translate, at all well. I think those are the little moments of humor and context that we'll end up missing.
So speaking of context, I read this fabulous article in the New Yorker about Rumi and how, because Rumi has become so easily exportable, especially to the Western world, one of the things that has happened in the translation of his poetry is the gradual erasure of the Islamic context. Because, for the reasons that the world is today, the idea of associating Rumi with, in a Western context with the Quran and with these beautiful ideas that actually originate in the faith don't travel well. And so because of that, the context of that has slowly been neutralized almost. And that struck me because I realized, yes, there's actually so much that I understand because I was raised in a context where Islam was present. But when you look at the way his poetry is often, shared in memes online, Instagrammed, they are often divorced from that context.
In the middle of the night, I cried out, "Who lives in this love I have?" You said, "I do, but I am not here alone. Why are these other images with me?" I said, "They are reflections of you, just as the beautiful inhabitants of Chigil and Turkestan resemble each other." You said, "But who is this other living being?" "That is my wounded soul." Then I brought that soul to you as a prisoner.
I actually think that this might be a topic for another show. How
Absolutely.
growing up in a country where we live side by side with Islam on a daily basis actually helps to inform a lot of the stuff that you read, especially from Middle Eastern authors, especially
Yes.
from authors of the faith. It really changes things tremendously. When I was thinking of translations and how they've impacted my reading life, the book that came to mind, and it's one of my favorites, it's one of my all-time, I revisit this well often. It's Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude,
Yes.
which, he is one of those Latin American giants of literature, right?
100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. At that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses, built on the bank of a river of clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous, like prehistoric eggs. The world was so recent that many things lacked names, and in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point.
When you think of magical realism, which is a genre, I guess we
Almost
can call it
originated by him, I think.
pretty much.
Yeah.
And for the longest time, I was obsessed with the idea of roses because it was so present in his
Yes.
work. And adored it. And the same thing happened where I read 100 Years of Solitude and later on thought to myself, what am I missing? You know, this is so beautiful and absorbing, and I read it and I cry and I'm moved. And what would I be getting if I could read it in Spanish? And times like that, you think, you know, I could have been a polyglot. I should have tried harder. I should have worked harder in
See,
that.
it makes me really sad, right? Because, I mean, I'm Indian, but I don't speak Bengali. And I'm like, darn my life for not being able to understand Tagore in his original language.
But, you know, in the case of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there is this push for him also to recognize his translators, which he did constantly. You know, we're talking about people like Gregory Rabassa and Edith Grossman, of course, both of whom he said placed intuitiveness above intellectualism. And I think when you're translating something that is poetic and emotional, having that emphasis is crucial, because I don't need some sort of faithful, weird Google translation style, you know, version of what this book is. What I need is the spirit of the thing, right?
The soul of the writing.
Pretty much to be captured in its essence, and to have, I guess, the stamp of approval from the author himself, who said that actually he thought that they did a better job than the Spanish versions, which kind of surprises me. But it kind of reassures me that what I read is author approved.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because weirdly enough, when Tagore translates his own works to English, one of the things that many people think goes missing is a sense of that soul, because for some reason, the original Bengali is written in this intimate, familiar language. And when he translated them into English, he felt the need to use thous and these, and Gitanjali is filled with thous and these. And I'm not sure whether it's because he was appealing to the Western British audience of that time. But yes, so to me, it sort of places a layer between the reader and the poem when actually the things that are being talked about are very intimate and almost the way you'd speak to a lover.
Do you have translations that you particularly enjoy? Do you notice even? Do you pay attention to who has translated the book that you're reading? Is that important to you? You can tell us. WhatsApp 018-789-8899. Tweet us at BFM Radio. And of course, you can write us at buythebook@bfm.my.